Today, we're going to unpack one of the absolute darkest chapters of the 20th century, Stalin's Great Terror. But we're not just going to look at it like some distant historical event. No, we're going to explore it for what it really was, a systematic, chillingly methodical machine of political genocide, a machine that was designed and operated from the very top.
Now this isn't a line from some grim movie. It's a real conversation, a real chat between two officials of the secret police, the NKVD. These were guys on a three-person panel that just handed down death sentences without a real trial, and it was a competition, a daily quota. The sheer casualness of it all tells you everything you need to know about how human life was turned into just a number on a scoreboard.
And here's the thing. This wasn't just about rounding up ordinary people or known enemies. The system turned on itself with an absolutely brutal efficiency. You see, of the 139 members and candidates of the Communist Party's own Central Committee, we're talking the absolute elite of the regime, elected just a few years earlier, 98 of them were arrested and shot. This was a purge that literally consumed its own creators.
So you have to ask yourself, how does a state even organize murder on this kind of scale? Well, it wasn't random chaos, not at all. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign, directed from the very top through specific bureaucratic orders. These orders are what set the whole machine of death in motion, and it all started with pieces of paper, just like this one.
This is a direct quote from a Politburo resolution. In the language, it's just bone-chilling. Notice, it doesn't say arrest people. It says continue the operation of annihilating contingents. They turn entire ethnic groups into these military-style units to be liquidated. It's the language of pest control, not justice. This one document gave the official green light for the mass murder of minorities, all under the cover of state security.
And those cold, bureaucratic words had a devastating, very human reality. This was the passport of a man named Van Vichan. He was one of many Chinese laundry workers living in Moscow who was rounded up and executed simply for being Chinese. He wasn't a contingent. He was a person, with a name, with a face, whose entire life was just wiped out by an official order.
Okay, so for this machine to work out in the open, it needed a justification, right? You needed some kind of veneer of legality. The regime couldn't just come out and say, hey, we're killing people by the hundreds of thousands. So they built this twisted parallel reality using these elaborate show trials and public announcements, creating this bizarre logic to try and explain the unexplainable.
The main architect of this public story was this man, Andrei Vyshinsky, the general prosecutor. And the supreme irony, you can't make this up, is that Vyshinsky used to be a Menshevik. That means he was a political opponent of the Bolsheviks back during the revolution. And here he is, years later, fanatically prosecuting the very old Bolsheviks he once stood against, accusing them of betraying a revolution he wasn't even on board with in the first place. And this gives you a taste of his logic. In his speeches, Vyshinsky basically invented this fantasy world where the Soviet Union was a perfect land of plenty. So any problem, like a food shortage, couldn't possibly be because of bad policy? Oh no, it was because of saboteurs. Traitors were intentionally creating these problems to make the government look bad. It was a perfect, all-encompassing conspiracy theory.
So this brings us to the question that just baffled the entire world at the time. You had these public trials where decorated heroes of the revolution would stand up and confess to being spies and saboteurs their whole lives. Why? Why would they do that? How could a regime possibly get these detailed, self-destroying lies out of its most hardened revolutionaries?
Well, the answer was a systematic process of just complete physical and psychological destruction. This was never about finding the truth. It was about manufacturing a confession. The NKVD would keep people awake for weeks. They'd face constant beatings, constant verbal abuse, and all the while they'd be threatening to arrest and shoot their wives, their children. It was a combination designed to utterly break a person's will, to make them sign anything at all, just to make the nightmare stop.
Okay, so let's shift now from the abstract system and talk about the actual individuals caught in its gears. Because to really understand the terror, you have to look at the stories of both the victims who were ground up by the machine and the perpetrators who kept it running.
Let's take the case of Dr. Dmitry Plotnev. This man wasn't a politician, he was a world-famous doctor. But before he was ever even arrested, the state newspaper, Pravda, ran this insane article accusing the 66-year-old doctor of being a sadistic rapist. This was the playbook. First, you destroy their character in public. You humiliate them, you isolate them. And then, only then, do you make the arrest.
And This is Dr. Pletnev's own account of what happened to him next. These are his own words, written in prison. He describes being choked, deprived of sleep, threatened. The interrogation was so brutal that it literally caused him to have a stroke, paralyzing half his body. That is the reality behind the signed confessions that were read out in court.
Now, let's look at one of the most famous defendants, Nikolai Bukharin. In his case, the NKVD actually failed to get a full confession before the trial. So, Vyshinsky just adapted. He turned the trial itself into the interrogation. Before Bukharin even had a chance to defend himself, Vyshinsky paraded this long line of witnesses who had already confessed, and each one just piled on more accusations. It was pure political theater, designed to create this overwhelming public show of guilt before the main defendant even had a chance to say a single word.
So, what was the effect of all this? Well, it was twofold. Inside the Soviet Union, it created a society that was just paralyzed by fear. And outside the Soviet Union, it created this profound confusion, as both friends and enemies of the USSR tried to figure out what on earth was happening.
This account from a party activist is absolutely chilling. I mean, just imagine it. You're at a meeting, and accusers could just show up, point fingers, and add names to an enemies list on the spot. It was so arbitrary that people would literally just flee the building in terror when they saw the accusers walk in. This had nothing to do with justice. It was about spreading maximum paranoia.
This quote from a French socialist newspaper just perfectly captures the dilemma for anyone watching from the outside. They were stuck. Option 1, the founders of the Soviet state were all traitors, which would mean the whole regime was rotten from the very beginning. Or option 2, the accused are innocent, which means the government is a monstrous machine of lies and murder. Either way you looked at it, the conclusion was devastating.
And all this time, Stalin's great rival, Leon Trotsky, was watching from exile, and he argued that the terror was just a profound act of national self-harm. By executing his most experienced generals, his best industrial managers, his top diplomats, Stalin wasn't making the Soviet Union stronger, he was gutting it. He was weakening his own army and discrediting his government on the world stage, right as Hitler's Germany was gearing up for war.
The Great Terror finally, officially wound down in late 1938, but its consequences have cast a very, very long shadow over all the decades that followed. The damage wasn't just in the lives that were lost, but in the truth that was buried and the culture that was completely silenced.
This timeline really shows you how long that silence lasted. The terror ends in 38, and then the whole story just vanishes. Stalin dies in 53. A few years later, Khrushchev gives his famous secret speech, but he only condemns some of the crimes, and really importantly, he refuses to exonerate the victims of the big show trials. It wasn't until the late 1980s, 50 years later, that official Soviet encyclopedias would even print the names of men like Bukharin or Trotsky. 50 years of silence.
Trotsky also wrote about the cultural devastation. The terror didn't just get rid of political rivals. It created an atmosphere where any kind of independent thought was deadly. The most talented, the most creative minds were silenced. And as he put it, the untalented scoundrel triumphs across the board. And this led to a massive decline in the cultural and moral level of society that would honestly last for generations.
But even inside that nightmare, there were these moments of incredible clarity and defiance. There's a story about Pavel Polstashev, one of the old Bolsheviks, who was in a debate with a fellow prisoner. The other prisoner was trying to justify their fate, as a necessary sacrifice for socialism. Polstashev's response just cuts right to the absolute heart of the matter. It was a total betrayal of everything the revolution was supposed to be about.
And that really is the question this whole history leaves us with. The Great Terror wasn't just a campaign of murder. It was a campaign against memory itself. It was a systematic attempt to erase people, to rewrite history, and to bury the truth under a mountain of lies. And it's a powerful reminder that when a state uses all its power to create and enforce a false reality, the struggle to unearth the real truth is long, it's difficult, and it is absolutely essential.